Bohdana Neborak is editor-in-chief at The Ukrainians. She is host of an award-winning video project about decolonization as well. Bohdana is ex-head of the translation department at the Ukrainian Book Institute and has a 7-year career in journalism, writing about culture and the creative industries. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like, subscribe, and of course, share links to the channel to help more people discover the fantastic content and speakers that we feature. Welcome to the channel. I'm really delighted to be able to speak to you.
Thank you for having me here, Jonathan.
Well, it's a huge pleasure. You're based in Kiev, but just before we were recording, you were telling me that Lviv is where you were originally from, and of course, I ran the event there in Lviv. Lviv is the center of culture, and what is in your view, what is the importance of Lviv, and how have attitudes around Ukraine changed, let's say from, through the Soviet period, through the 90s, and now in time of war? It seems Lviv has become more and more important through that period.
What a huge question. I need to say that what we all got during this war is that we all felt here in Ukraine, but also outside of the country, how big our country is. And it definitely means also that it is very multicultural, that it needs to be inclusive, and that it has very different heritage inside of the country. When we speak about Lviv, Lviv also played and still plays a very specific role in Ukraine, and I want to be very delicate because we can speak like that about any city. But definitely I have this very private connection towards my native city. And it always was an important place. For example, when we speak about the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century, it was the only place in Ukraine. Lviv was under Austro-Hungary, but there were many people who were active in politics. So it was the only place where Ukrainian language books could be published. So people from Kyiv, from Kharkiv, from another regions of Ukraine, which was a part of Imperial Russia, were able to go to Lviv and to publish, for example, new books about feminism, which was a point in that time in Ukraine, and we had very powerful intellectual voices. We may find examples from different epochs. Of course, it is quite easy for me to recall something from my own life. And I always remember Lviv as a very active cultural point where very different people were able to make new art, contemporary art. For example, when you were in Lviv, probably somebody told you about Zyga. Zyga is a very important art center, which was founded after our first revolution of students in 1990. It was and is an important art center. They do festivals, people of culture gather there, they spend time, they have new ideas flourishing around this place. But I think also that what is important in Lviv is that it still tries to stay active and to change, because right now the city is one of the main hubs for so many internally displaced people, and they of course need to find their places, and of course they need also to find their place in the context of culture. I mean, to interact with theaters, with galleries, with different institutions of art. And it also influences the city because the visitor, the spectator, the viewer changes just because he or she becomes much more diverse. And I'm really fond of looking how this city changes right now, because I think that The experiences there just become more diverse, and it is also good for art sphere, but also it gives much broader space for the dialogue.
Sorry, couldn't get the mute button undone there. And in terms of publishing, Lviv is still an incredibly important center of the publishing industry. There's the Lviv Book Fair. I had the huge pleasure to meet Sofia Chiliak when I was in the town, and she was kind enough to be one of the panelists on the event that we ran. It's growing in importance as well, isn't it? As Russians have made their language toxic and painful to many Ukrainians to hear and speak it, which is absolutely understandable, there has also been a rise and an uptake in Ukrainian language books and publishing. How important do you think that is for future Ukrainian identity, but also perhaps resilience as well of Ukrainian culture?
I'm very glad that you were able to attend the book forum. It is the festival where I feel I grew up with, because it is even older than me. I think that festivals as such are very important because it is a place where people meet, where they spend quality time together, where they have different conversations, and where they can enjoy art. So, of course, the book forum is one of the most important in Ukraine, but it is very interesting how the things changed after the Revolution of Dignity, after 2014, because then the reform of decentralization began in Ukraine. And that means that local networks and small local initiatives gained much power. Also, they gained more access to, for example, different funds, and small festivals across Ukraine started to flourish. We also need to remember the book arsenal, which is a big literary event in Kyiv. It is also very important, but there were really very different events across the country. And it is just about the access to culture. You understand that you may see an alive writer, and it sounds very stupid in a way. It sounds as a cliche, but it is very important to listen to a contemporary who writes about your country and realities in the world in your language. And I think that it really influenced it a lot after the Revolution of Dignity. But when we speak about these places of publishing, I always want to emphasize the importance of Kharkiv. Kharkiv still is heavily shelled, and Kharkiv still publishes a lot of literature, because a lot of main publishers, but also the main places just to print, I mean print houses or for different publishings across Ukraine, they're located in Kharkiv. It is also very symbolic because in 19th century, Kharkiv was the main place where Ukraine as idea was flourishing. There was a university, there was a circle of Kharkiv romantics, as they called themselves, and they did a lot. And Kharkiv still is kind of platform for this Ukrainian idea as such. But it is also about how huge Ukraine is, because as I told before, when some of the publishers understood that they are not able to print books in Kharkiv because some of the print houses were heavily damaged, they were able to switch somehow and to print, for example, in Lviv region, in Ivano-Frankivsk region, in Kyiv region, and so on. And it is very important when you are able to choose and when you have space where you can move. That's what we felt even in this literary industry.
I'll ask you in a minute about your publication, because I think it's fascinating to learn how that came about. But before we get there, when we're talking about the creation of culture, obviously in this period, not just the full-scale war, but since 2014, Russia has been systematically targeting and destroying Ukrainian culture. Where it's distinctly Ukrainian, their tactic seems to be to annihilate it. Where that culture is more international, or where it is a hybrid of Russified culture with Ukrainian culture combined, or whether it's historical dating back to the Soviet or prior periods, they tend to be looting it, stealing it, taking it back. We know that they tried very hard to steal Scythian gold and deep archaeological objects. As this has been unfolding, how's your publication been sort of covering this issue, and what is your view on this extraordinary behavior, which has a direct comparison to how the Nazis looted Europe during the Second World War?
And the Ukrainians, we write a lot about cultural figures and about culture as such. We make interviews, we do reporting, we do podcasts, and so on. And I need to say that probably one of our main goals since the beginning of full war was to keep focus on Ukrainian culture and to focus on Ukrainian culture in the context of the world culture. Because when we come into post-colonial discourse, it is very easy just to keep this connection, Russia and Ukraine. Of course, we have Ukraine and Ukrainian culture as a victim, and we have Russia as an aggressor. It is obvious. We don't need to have conversations around this. But when we speak about another steps, I think that it is very important, especially right now, to understand the narratives and the special features of Ukrainian culture, to feel it in the context, first of all, of European culture, because it is a part of it. Our creatives, they were educated here and in Europe, but here our universities in Kyiv and in Lviv, they operated like European ones. They translated from European languages. They had very different connections, and unfortunately, a lot of these stories were blinded or forgotten in different ways, mainly during the Soviet times. But also they were forgotten because it is very difficult to interact with the culture of a country which doesn't have a nation state. And Ukraine was, from the point of view of so many countries of the world, a nation which doesn't have a state. And we all remember this famous essay by Milan Kundera, where he writes about this big nation of 40 million Ukrainians who are vanished by the Russians. And he thinks that, unfortunately, Ukrainians don't have a future. It is written in the 80s of last century, but we understand how pessimistic everybody was about Ukraine. And I think that we just need to dive into these Ukrainian narratives, and it is quite difficult because there are several problems, and the first problem probably is the lack of translations. We have a plenty, but it is also a tradition of translation from the language, a tradition of communication about important figures of one's culture. Also, there is, of course, issue of Russian propaganda. Like, for so many years, so many great museums across the world were praising great Russian avant-garde. And right now, people are discovering that this avant-garde is probably great, but not that Russian. And it is a problem for so many professionals across the world because they were educated at their universities that, for example, Malevich or Oleksandr Kraiev or Archipenko or so many famous artists that they're great Russians. And right now you need to ask yourself, why have you discovered this only now? And I don't want to condemn anybody, but it is about the switch of understanding of things and of approaches which were very close to you. This is the way I try to speak about culture, because what I am really afraid is to lose this possibility. For example, to dive into the stories of Lesia Ukrainka, who is right now quite well translated. She's becoming well translated, first of all into English. And she has really unique approaches into her playwrights. But also, when we speak about her, we may speak about how she wasn't able to publish in Ukrainian in Kyiv, and it will be not the conversation about her art, but this will be the conversation about what Russian Empire did to Ukrainian culture. These both conversations are very, very important, but what I really want is to make these voices of Ukrainians much vocal. And I think that it is really a big issue for all us here right now.
And there's a horrible irony, isn't there, that for many years, and including during the 2014 to 2022 period, there was not a huge focus on Ukraine, despite what's going on. Russian propaganda was able, with some success, to paint it as a internal struggle, civil war, etc., etc. They were able to carry on trying to diminish Ukraine, and part of that was by elevating Russian culture. And despite their invasion of Ukraine, there was very little sanction or discussion of Russian imperial culture and how it was perceived around the world. In 2021, I was in Paris and I didn't get to see it. He's one of my favorite artists, but it was Ilya Repin. And of course, that exhibition was labeled an exhibition of Russian art, irrespective of the fact that one of the greatest Russian artists turns out to have been born in Ukraine and extremely influenced by Ukrainian identity and themes. So this is a process that's only just really starting in I would say, the West, is this understanding of the decolonization of Russian art. The horrible irony, though, isn't it, is that it took a full-scale invasion. The other irony with translation is that authors such as Victoria Amelina are only now getting the judgment and translations they deserve, precisely because they're either under threat or, tragically, in the case of Amelina, were actually killed by a Russian missile. So could you describe this sort of process? On the one hand, the positivity that Ukrainian culture is getting more attention, but also the tragedy that that's because it's under the threat of extermination.
I think that it is a tragedy, and it must be called in this way, because, for example, Victoria Amelina, with the name of Amelina, we will start a new project together with PEN Ukraine about people who died because of Russian aggression and who were killed by Russians. She wanted to spread the truth from Ukraine, and she was brave enough to go to a war zone together with international authors and journalists to show them the essence of the Russian world. I think that we need to speak about it in the context of colonialism, really, because it just gives us very accessible theoretical approach, which we already have in English well developed. And I'm just thinking about one of the most famous Ukrainian novels, which is one of the best translated novels worldwide. I will show you the first edition in Ukrainian. It is a book by Oksana Zabushko, and it is called The Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex. In general, it is a short novel about a woman who comes to North America to a conference, and she tries to explain herself and her country. It is imaginable conference, and she sits in front of the mirror and talks to herself. And Oksana Zabushko writes how she was frequently asked about her country, and always she was asked it is somewhere close to Russia. And she tries to depict us the image of intellectual from such a country and how he or she could feel. Because when we speak about this country somewhere close to Russia, we mean a big 40 million country with very deep roots, with deep heritage, with interesting culture, a country of a very big quantity of people with very different traditions and very specific culture. And I think that we again come back to this question when somebody who thought that it is a country close to Russia and similar to Russia understands that it is a country with a language, with a culture, with intellectual tradition. He or she must admit that there was a tragic mistake. But the biggest tragedy is that here Ukrainians, they pay for this mistake, and they pay with their lives, they pay with their destinies, because I follow so many creatives who, for example, joined the military, and they protect their right to be Ukrainian directors or to be Ukrainian writers with arms. Also, I follow so many writers who just changed their writing, and there are many powerful voices who are working on novels, on scripts, and so on. But after the full war, they changed their work because they understand that they need to document or they need to testify and write essays for foreign media. So it is the way in which we pay, because people here who work in journalism or who write, they also understand that we had this, how people like to say, window of possibilities, and we need to use it just to tell a pinch of truth, because probably this pinch will help in some way in 2 years, in 3 years. And it is also a big change in the work of people here. But I'm not trying to say it in lower tone, because it is also their decision, because they feel that in this way they work for the victory of their country, but also they work for this decolonial struggle to feel free and to help people around them really feel free.
Well, let's turn to your publication, The Ukrainians. I've, with the help of Google Translate, been able to have a good look at the extraordinary range of articles there. Could you tell me a little bit about how the publication came about, its evolution, but also how its focus has changed during the full-scale war?
I work full-time with the Ukrainian Media for more than 2 years, and I'm a chief editor of the website. I work with interviews mainly and with feature articles. The Ukrainian Media started after the Revolution of Dignity, and it started from the very idealistic idea of 3 students who wanted to make long reads with interesting Ukrainians who were able to share their experience and to comment on the situation around and so on. It changed a lot since then, because right now we have the Reporters magazine. We print it and we do literary reporting. It is long-form features. We also have a podcast studio where we do a lot of podcasts. Some of them are in English even. And our main focus, of course, is also interviews and long and deep conversations with people that we want to highlight. I can say that our work really changed because we kept the same focus which was before. It is good journalism in Ukrainian, and it is also long-form journalism. We have news, and when the full war started, definitely we focused much on the news desk. But I think that maybe 1 or 2 months after, we were in, of course, not regular mode of work, but we got back to all the formats that we were approaching. And for example, together with my colleague and friend, we launched this podcast about decolonization and imperialism and Ukrainian culture in the very beginning of April. So I think it was rather soon.
And looking at the site, I mean, there's a fascinating phrase. Obviously, there are different funding models for magazines like yours, but you've got the incredible phrase here, which I think is fantastic. У нас немає інвесторів других політиків, which in English there is that you do not have any investors, you do not have any friendly politicians or corrupt patrons. That's an extraordinary statement, but there's quite a lot behind that, isn't there? And you could trace the history of Ukrainian media from a oligarch-dominated media sphere to the sort of robust and evolving media environment that exists today. So how important is it for you and your colleagues to make a statement like that and to not have these kind of influences on your editorial choices?
Yeah, it is about our funding, and I think that it is an issue across the world. Like, we have people who want to influence media everywhere, in every country and in every democracy, unfortunately. When we were working on our founding model, we were thinking that we want to work on a membership program. Because the only connection we want to really feel is the connection to our readers. I also run a book club for our members at the Ukrainians, and we have more than 800 people who are interacting in different ways with our book club. We have live events with interesting intellectuals in Kyiv monthly, and we also make an online version for all those people who are across the country, but also abroad. And I told this because it is my possibility to see those people who support us, to listen to their questions, to understand which literature do they like and what do they want to get from the media. So it is very, very important for us to work on this possibility of funding. And I encourage all our viewers, listeners to check our Patreon and to consider supporting us, because only with the support of our patrons we are able to make new products and to go on.
And let's tackle a theme that has been elevated, I think, recently in the Western media. And this is for a variety of reasons. This is the so-called war fatigue. And I've been speaking to a number of people, especially those who are in Ukraine itself, who are either fighting on the front line or engaged in journalism, civic activity, volunteer groups. It seems to me that there is a big difference between the narratives that are prominent in the Western media and actual attitudes in Ukraine itself. This idea of war fatigue seems to be a manufactured concept, partly through media, dare I say it, sort of laziness and perhaps being ill-informed, but also there seems to be a real attempt by Russian disinformation, by useful idiots and assets in the West to create and amplify this idea of stalemate, war fatigue, etc., etc. Could you comment on that from a Ukrainian perspective? People must be tired, of course. People must be emotionally, it's incredibly tough to be under missile fire continuously now for almost 2 years. But do you think this idea of war fatigue is far too simplistic and does not adequately describe the sort of resilience and energy that Ukrainians seem to be showing still in defending their freedoms, country, and identity?
Very important question, and recently I had an interview with Peter Pomerantsev for the Ukrainians, and he told that it is very important to divide tiredness and fatigue, because when person is tired, you may get good sleep, good food, and then you go on. But when you have this fatigue, you don't understand how to move, and why do you support, for example? So of course, fatigue is very important point to discuss. I also need to say that here in Ukraine, people don't have a right to fatigue. Of course, people are very tired on different levels, and that's what I see beneath my colleagues, for example. Of course, we are tired. Of course, people want to feel safety and so on. But also they understand that they won't get this safety unless Russia is defeated in some way, and they come back to their peaceful lives. But when we speak about foreigners, I also think that there is a very important issue to discuss. It is how war and content from war becomes the attraction. If you just view it from a paper or from your laptop screen, unfortunately, there was a lot of very difficult content from Ukraine, and people were shocked. They were shocked that it is possible, and how it was frequently written that it is possible in 21st century, that it is possible on European continent, that it is possible even after never again motto, and so on. But then this shock becomes lighter, and another problem arises, and this problem is, have you done enough to stop this? If you consider something an atrocity, a war crime, a crime against humanity, or a genocide, and if you feel that you're adult person, probably you need to interact in some way. And then everybody asks, it is very private question, yes, and it is important. It is not easy to answer it. So I think that some people, or even many people, they also lose attention because they might also feel that they haven't done enough, or they want to say that they already have done enough and it didn't help. So now we can do nothing. But it all doesn't matter, because war in Ukraine goes on, and there are so many occupied territories. And we all remember how the war crimes look when some territories are liberated, and when we start documenting war crimes. Unfortunately, it happens right now. When we speak, it happens, and when any of our viewers listens to us, war crimes of Russians also happen. And that means that we need to protest, and we need to help Ukraine stop this, because it will go on.
And of course, the famous phrase came about early in the war that if Ukrainians stop fighting, there will be no more Ukraine. If Russians stop fighting, well, Russia will still continue to exist. Do people still have that strong sense that they are fighting against someone who wants to eliminate their identity, language? And if you are a cultural figure like yourself and your colleagues, there is a mortal threat if you were to be under occupation, potentially you and your colleagues would all be the targets for Russian sort of genocidal aggression.
Yeah, I think that you really gave a very good context of what we have in Ukraine right now, because people understand that the aim stays the same. We also follow, I think that we all follow how the Russians are commenting on why they are having this war, like war, special military operation against Nazis, against LGBT people, against Europe, against NATO. They are switching in their testimonies. But what we definitely know is that it is war against Ukraine as such, and that if we want to live, it is the question of existence. We need to support our military, we need to advocate Ukraine, and we need to explain Ukraine and tell the stories of Ukraine, because the main story from Ukraine right now is definitely the story about war and about war context. But Ukraine is much more than war. Ukraine has many stories to be told. And when we come to victims are also much bigger than just court cases. They have lives, they have private lives, they have interests, they have people whom they love, they have native cities, they have favorite books, and so on. And it is very, very important now to dive into these stories, because it also gives us very personal perspective. And I really believe that probably it might work with this idea of fatigue, because that's what we are also trying to do in our magazine. We try to tell people stories, and of course we speak about big narratives and about big contexts, but human being is in the center of everything. And we are so many times recalling with you this history of 20th century. And right now I'm just thinking about Hersch Lauterpacht, who was one of the main lawyers of the last century. And by the way, he was educated at Lviv University at the same faculty where I was also educated. He told that the sole human being is the main entity of the law. So we always need to keep our attention to human stories.
That's incredibly powerful. And that raises a question. And I think partly this was addressed in one of your recent articles. Let's fast forward to Ukrainian victory. Let's assume, as we hope, that victory is maximalist and Ukraine regains its territory. In the areas that have been scarred by war, and most areas have, but especially those that have been under occupation, there are going to be terrible stories and terrible discoveries. How do you think in future Ukraine will honor the memories of the victims? How will monuments be constructed? And I very much compare this to my experiences of going through Russia, because there in the Soviet period, and I think even now, people only remember traumatic episodes in history because the state has told them to do so. If there's a physical monument there, they remember that, but they remember it in a way that has been crafted by the state, and they remember it through narratives that the state has used to manipulate them. How is Ukraine going to get away from that into a more organic, personal, and humane way of memorializing the victims? And of course, Russian crimes are so widespread, there is a risk of having a vast traumascape of monuments to suffering, whereas Ukraine is also a very forward-looking country, a future-looking, and I dare say optimistic people. How is it's going to be difficult, isn't it, to balance that historical memory with looking forward as well?
I think that it is a really a big thing, and fortunately we have historians who work with the history of public memory in Ukraine during the Soviet times. For example, one of probably the most powerful is Serhiy Yakelchik, who works in Canada, and he has several books in English about public memory during Stalin times, but also further. And he writes a lot about commemoration and about good and, how to say, bad examples of public memory. Probably it is not about good or bad, but better to say how it influences the society and how it influences the way the society remembers. And I have asked him about the commemoration, and he told that he really likes that memorials that in some way have the names of, for example, fallen soldiers, that also put this attention on each human being, because the human life is something that can't be changed for anything, and we cannot give anything valuable enough to families who have lost their close. So I think that commemoration is very important, but I also feel that we have professionals who might work with this. But of course, it is very important, first of all, to put an end to Russian occupation, but also to work in a broad sense with the idea of justice to be served, because it is about courts. But it is also how you said about public commemoration. It is about possibility to reflect. And what I personally discovered in this time is that memory is painful. You need to remember, you need to invest in remembrance, but it is very difficult and very painful. In last century, we all were mainly thinking that it is difficult to remember because, for example, there is censorship, or there is official public memory which is put down from Moscow and you just need to follow it. But right now, I also feel that we need to work with this difficulty of remembrance and the right of private person to try to forget. But I also think that there are enough responsible people who want to not only to testify, but to try to reflect and to comment. And I think that Ukrainian culture will deal with this. But first of all, we need to win this war.
And of course, it's important that these memorialization and monuments don't just come from the state, from the government, even from local authorities, that actually it also involves people, and that in some of these initiatives ought to be coming from the ground up. I think one of the most shocking experiences I had in Russia was not just the realization of the lack of empathy and humanity, but this extraordinary process that unless the government had labeled something and told people how they ought to think about it, it's as if that thing didn't exist. This is a very, let's say, Pomeranzian kind of idea, or even David Satter writes about this, it didn't happen, it was a long time ago and it didn't happen anyway. That's the kind of concept. I was on a train going and it was during a sort of wintry period, so there was snow cover, and I went on a train towards Vorkuta. And of course, if you head up into that part of Russia, you're starting to go through the areas where the Gulag system was very extensive. And in the tundra, we went past a huge wooden prison camp that must have dated for the 1930s, probably abandoned in the 1950s, not preserved in any way, not labeled as a historical monument. It's not a museum, nothing, just a vast prison camp with the crumbling watchtowers and walls and barbed wire in the middle of the tundra. And I asked people in the carriage, well, what on earth is that? It was incredibly visually striking and terrifying. And because it doesn't have an official designation, literally everybody to a person said it's nothing, as if it doesn't really exist, as if no one really suffered there. It's nothing. It's not important. And that struck me as horrific on so many different different levels. That's the danger, isn't it? That if you leave this moralization to governments, the pain, the trauma is not processed in a humane way. So do you think Ukraine has a good chance of avoiding those mistakes and issues?
I think that it is also the responsibility of intellectuals in the society, how they keep some important narratives and how they reflect on them, how they interact with them, how they explain them, and how they explain their influence on the contemporary society. So just to comment on what you told, I think that Russians have a lot of work to be done in this context. At the same time, I feel that Ukrainian intellectuals always felt responsible for the memory here in this country. So I'm not afraid that it won't happen. I just want that people to have space for this, because unfortunately, so many of them don't have this space, and they mainly don't leave the country under any conditions. In the very beginning of the full war, I was asked by some colleagues to give recommendations on people who could come to universities, mainly in North America, and to have these courses about Ukrainian something. It was a period when everybody wanted to have a course which will give you an introduction to Ukrainian something or everything. But to avoid this, I need to say that no one from those people that I recommended accepted the invitation, unfortunately, I think, because I would be happy if they speak about Ukraine at these places, but they all felt that they need to stay with their society, with their country. They sometimes go abroad to short trips to festivals or to perform at university, but they don't want to leave the country, especially right now. So it is also something that shows the position of many influential intellectuals here. So I think that they will do their job when time comes, and they already write a lot about memory issues, so they work on it.
And the last question, I think, is an interesting one, and that's about cooperation. From doing these interviews, I see a lot of intergenerational cooperation, a lot of cooperation across genders, but also an extremely strong interaction between the, as you say, people who will travel abroad but are fundamentally located in Ukraine, but also the Ukrainian diaspora. And that includes the diaspora that goes all the way back to the Soviet period, even those families that left during the Holodomor in the 1930s. There seems to be an extraordinary connection, and one that is actually growing rather than diminishing, between the diaspora and the mother country, as it were. So in your view, how important is it, these interactions between different demographics, groups, the diaspora and Ukrainian citizens? How does that really contribute to Ukrainian identity and resilience?
I think it is very important because it is about different experiences to be discussed. For example, when we speak about the diaspora of 20th century, those were people who fled Soviet Ukraine and who understood that they are responsible to keep the memory. At the same time, they believed, but they were not sure that there will be independent Ukraine anymore. And I think that it is very painful image of life. When you understand that probably you and your kids are the last who will speak your native language in which literature that you love was written, and so on, and your parents spoke. So they have this very special experience. At the same time, they took many of the archives and saved them. Many of the archives still are in Harvard, also in New York, but also in Canada. Some of the archives are in Prague, some are in Germany. Many were allocated back to Ukraine, but many still keep in these places where, for example, first Ukrainian studies were launched, because there were people who played the roles of the huge institutions. They understood that. For example, there is a famous literary scholar, George Lutsky, who was the first person to write a PhD about the Stalin's politics against literary figures in Soviet Ukraine, or about the executed Renaissance generation. And he understood that if he didn't do this in English, and if he wasn't able to present it at Columbia University, where this work was done, nobody will know in these circles about the executed Renaissance. Of course, it also doesn't mean that there rose a huge circle of people who understood the, for example, essence of Stalin's politics. But some understood. And right now we have this work from the 50s, which is an important point of our intellectual history, but also it is just very important deed of a very special individual. And there are many such cases where people just understood that they are responsible for this. And I think that it is also very inspirational for many people in Ukraine, but also in contemporary diaspora, because they feel that if their ancestors did such things, they also need to invest in Ukraine as an idea, to find this very personal connection and to build this connection stronger.
That's absolutely fascinating. And there are so many themes here, I'd like to explore in more detail. We are unfortunately out of time. I'm so grateful to you for spending the time to dig into some of these issues. And I recommend people check out the publication. So even though it's in Ukrainian, Google Translate does a pretty good job of, you can get the sense of the articles. And of course, you do have some podcasts in English as well. So we'll pop a link in here. But Bohdana, thank you so much. Thanks so much for your time and for the work of you and your colleagues.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.